This is a podcast by the Straits Times.
Would you volunteer your time and effort to get your child into a primary school of your choice? For many parents, it's a no-brainer, even if it involves a huge commitment. Under the P1 registration system, parents who complete at least 40 hours of volunteer work for a school can get priority for admissions. It sounds pretty straightforward, but from what we're hearing on the ground, it's anything but. Parents are lining up to even put up their hands to volunteer in choice schools. Far from being traffic wardens, parents now submit CVs or propose curriculums to schools to be considered for skills-based volunteering. Others even ballot just to get a place to be a volunteer. And at the end of it, priority for admission doesn't guarantee your child could actually get a spot in the school. Hi, I'm Leanne Chia, Assistant Opinion Editor at the Straits Times and a mother of a child about to enter Primary 1 next year. To unpack the role of volunteering on the P1 registration scheme in this episode of In Your Opinion, I'm joined by a keen observer of Singapore's education system. Associate Professor Jason Tan from the National Institute of Education. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Leanne.
Okay, so maybe let's start with understanding the historical context behind this volunteer scheme. Why did the government actually introduce it?
I think a big part of the reason probably has to do with the government's push sometime in the late 1990s to encourage greater parental engagement with their children's education. And this particular priority that's awarded to parent volunteers is clearly a sort of incentive to get parents to think seriously about helping the school that they intend to register their child in.
Why was there even a need to push parents to do this?
Well, I think that if you look at the entire Primary 1 registration system, a lot of the criteria have to do with incentives that reward not the individual children for the most part, but instead their parents and what their parents can bring to the table when it comes to Primary 1 registration. In addition to parent volunteering, we also have other sorts of incentives such as being an alumnus of the school, having a parent who's working in the school, being affiliated with the relevant clan association or religious body, and so on. And of course, the Primary 1 registration system, if you think about it, is really quite a distinctive one because I think it's the only registration system that brings into play so much of what the parents are all about instead of the individual child. And that makes this particular registration system stand out in contrast with, say, the secondary school registration system or the polytechnic registration system.
Is the idea of getting parents more involved in their children's life maybe one of the reasons why the government actually put that incentive in a way?
That was probably a strong motivator because I think that a lot of the criteria, if you think about them more deeply, are reflective of underlying values. They're not just there out of nowhere. So the existence of all the different phases and also the prioritization of the various criteria within a hierarchy are reflective, therefore, of underlying values, what the Ministry of Education thinks is more important.
So there is a benefit, right, to getting parents involved long-term in their children's life?
The research literature internationally certainly seems to support that assertion.
The volunteering scheme, I think it was the late 90s, right? You mentioned that it actually started out with this goal of getting parents to be more involved. So what do you think, Jason? Do you think this has actually achieved its purpose?
If you think about the scheme and how it's evolved, it's quite interesting because the Ministry of Education allows each primary school autonomy when it comes to the question of parent volunteering. For example, whether the school wants in the first place to accept any parent volunteers. Secondly, how many volunteers it wishes to accept. Thirdly, what areas of volunteer work the school wishes to deploy the parents in. Fourthly, the duration, I guess, and the frequency of the volunteer work. And of course, admission is not guaranteed at all. Another thing for us to consider would be the reality that parents are not obliged to continue volunteering even after their child has secured admission to that particular primary school. So there's lots of questions that we might ask about, for instance, what is the meaning of voluntary work? Is it purely for altruistic reasons to benefit the wider school community? Or is it to some degree utilitarian as well, in a bid to secure preferential admission for one's child?
Yeah, because you mentioned that parents are not obliged to continue, right? Do you think the scheme actually kind of makes volunteering transactional in a way, in return for a place?
I guess that the scheme is trying to juggle a few competing objectives. It's trying to encourage that element of parental engagement. And at the same time, it's got that very focused element to secure preferential admission. It's easy, I think, to overlook the fact that sometimes parental circumstances might change. And some parents might not be able to continue their volunteering commitments for a whole variety of reasons after their child has secured primary one admission. So let's not forget that part of it. But at the same time, I think we have not mentioned something else, which is there's that element of inequalities. Because in the first place, not all parents are equally well placed to offer their voluntary services to primary schools. I think, for instance, not every parent is equally fluent in the main school languages, and therefore not every parent may be able to help out, say, with the school's reading program or to conduct courses on AI, say, on a voluntary basis.
Yeah, I think very much that seems to be the direction the schools are moving towards, right? More skills-based volunteering. Do you think the volunteering scheme, we're looking at it maybe 2 decades on, so has it effectively only rewarded parents who have the time and the know-how to navigate the system and to actually contribute in this way?
There definitely is that sort of bias, because in the first place, the family's financial circumstances need to be favorable. Secondly, the childcare arrangements at home need to be taken into consideration because that parent has to make that time commitment. And of course, we're talking about the parents' social capital, cultural capital. What sorts of experiences have they had in the past or right now that will enable them to make valuable contributions to the school and its activities?
Now it seems like there are more dual-income families now, right? Actually, for those who are dual-income in the way, how do they find the time to volunteer?
There's obviously that element of sacrifice that's involved. And of course, there's also that element as well of strategizing, because if you want to be considered for priority admission in this manner, you have to have begun your voluntary work at least a year in advance of primary one registration. At the same time, I believe there are parents out there who continue their volunteering work even after their child has secured admission. And yet again, there are also parents who may not have used voluntary work as a means of securing admission for their child, but who nevertheless are performing voluntary work in various primary schools.
If we look at the situation today, right, even if you want to be a volunteer, you can't even be guaranteed that the school wants you. I understand that actually there are quite a number of schools now who no longer accept parent volunteers. And because they can't manage the demand. And I guess what I'm wondering is, this kind of feels a bit like it's become an arms race for parents, a bit like what you alluded to previously. So, why do you think this has happened?
I think that the primary one registration system has become part of what some observers and even government officials have turned the education arms race, which is a rather unfortunate metaphor because it's really stark and bleak.
So it sounds like there are a lot of, how do I put it, challenges in the current system. So maybe the implementation could have been maybe good intentions, but in the way it actually played out, it sounds like things have actually changed, right, to make it become this arms race in a way.
What is intriguing to me, I think, is that even while the Ministry of Education has been putting in place various policy measures to dampen this sort of hyper-competitive way of thinking about education, and some of these measures include, for example, reforming the primary school leaving examination scoring system, opening up more education pathways. We see, I think, little signs of the temperature being lowered when it comes to the decisions being made by many parents and students. Singapore prides itself on operating a meritocratic system where individual hard work and effort are crucial for individual advancement. How is it, therefore, that we have a primary one registration system that is very largely premised on parents of the students and what they can do to secure their children an advantage, what they bring with them? If we think about it, it is clearly evidence of a parentocracy, which is a term that the British sociologist Philip Brown introduced in 1990 to describe a situation where a child's success in education comes to depend more and more on his or her parents and what they can do, what sorts of resources they have to help their children, instead of on the individual child's hard work and effort.
But then if that's the case, right, would there be a way to look at the child? I mean, the child is 6 years old, right?
You're very right. And that's why I think it's difficult to revamp the current system, because I don't think many listeners would be happy with the idea of testing 6-year-olds or conducting admission interviews. People would say, wow, this is not solving anything. In fact, on the contrary, you're adding to the arms race. And that's where I guess the idea of randomized allocation comes into the picture. Would it make sense to do away with so many layers of admission criteria and have a centrally administered randomized lottery system? And some people might say, okay, that doesn't privilege any particular segments of society, and that helps to level out the playing field. But of course, one big problem that would arise immediately would be that people might say these children are only 6+, and we don't want them to be traveling excessively long distances to school. At the same time, they might say this system doesn't make sense because I want my child to be in the same school as his or her elder siblings for convenience. See, so the primary one registration system, as I was saying to you just now, is rather distinctive because the age of the students involved lends itself to all sorts of considerations that we don't think are important when it comes to the later stages of schooling.
Yeah, it sounds like you can have two extremes. You can have your DSA-style admission interviews for 6-year-olds, which sounds problematic in itself. But on the other hand, maybe 100% fair system, like what you just described, I guess, that would also be problematic, right? So it's hard for the government to actually be able to kind of strike a balance between these two extremes, would you say?
Because you're trying to, I think, wrestle with competing values. What actually are you trying to achieve with your primary one registration system? It appears so controversial, I think in large part because parents see it as the child's initial and crucial big step into the formal schooling system. And therefore, a lot of parents want to make sure that they make a decision that will be as advantageous to their children as possible. Which then brings us to the question of every school a good school. The Ministry of Education has been actively promoting this ideal for over a decade now. But if we look at the amount of parental strategizing that's still going on, it would appear that not every parent subscribes to this particular ideal wholeheartedly. So the reality, I think, is there for us to see, which is that not every primary school is equally popular or equally well regarded. And a lot of parents still believe that the choice of a primary school matters for a whole variety of reasons.
Yeah, and the stakes are so high, right? To them, to the parents, the stakes are so high because it's the first stepping stone into formal education, right?
I don't think any parent wants to regret later on not having tried harder to get their children a good head start in life. I think that's not a situation that any parent wants to be in, and that's why I think there's a lot of parental anxiety over this sort of crucial decision, which primary school to choose.
And that's probably why they are doing all they can, in a way, like by this volunteering thing, to get their kids into a school of their choice, right?
If you look at the various criteria in the primary one registration system, you'll see a couple of things. Number one, not every school is equally affected by each and every one of the registration phases. What do I mean? For example, some of the newer primary schools do not have substantial body of school alumni who can qualify under that particular phase of admission. Then the second thing is that not every parent stands to benefit equally from each of the various phases in the registration system. A lot depends on events that can't be changed. For example, whether you went to a particular primary school, whether your child has an elder sibling already in that primary school, your ability to afford more expensive housing, and so on. So there's, I think, every incentive for a lot of parents to start their strategizing way ahead of the primary one registration. Because if you look at things like place of residence, volunteering work, grassroots leadership, all of these things have conditions attached to them in terms of the duration. How long you have been serving as a grassroots leader, how long you will be living at that particular home, and so on.
Yeah, so I think there's this tension here that I'm trying to understand a bit more about is that you get the parents, there's understandably a lot of parental anxiety. They feel the stakes are very high, but so they do all they can. And sometimes in the case of like volunteering, or you're still subject to a ballot. There's no guarantee to it, right?
Yes.
So what I've actually been hearing is that there have been quite a number of complaints from parents that they put in the effort to volunteer, they end up not getting into the school in the end. And in fact, there was even once a letter to the Straits Times Forum that actually called for those who volunteer to be guaranteed a place in the school. So, I mean, this comes across as sounding a bit entitled, I guess, but can we really blame the parents for feeling like that?
It's very high stakes for some parents, not for all parents. There are, of course, parents who are reasonably happy with the primary school that's nearby their home. But of course, for other parents out there, there's that very high stakes decision-making that's involved. And who can blame them? Because there's still the widespread perception that Singapore's education system is highly competitive. And there's also, I think, that sense of responsibility that many parents feel. And this is linked, of course, to what I said just now about the Ministry of Education actively encouraging greater parental engagement with their children's schooling. See, so there's this sort of extra responsibility didn't just appear out of nowhere. Many parents feel that they have to take on this important responsibility to do as much as they possibly can to ensure their children's education success. And of course, not every parent is equally well placed, which is what I said just now, to use financial resources, social networks, and their own skill sets to help their children gain a competitive edge in the school system.
I think this whole volunteering, the way that you're being kind of, I wouldn't use the word forced, but it sounds a bit like that, to volunteer your time, to get a chance to get your child into a school. It seems like this goes against the entire idea of volunteering as something you do out of the goodness of your heart without promise that you get something out of it. So what do you think?
I would say that beyond the question of parent volunteering, we have to take a hard look at the entire primary school registration system. Because it's trying, I think, to achieve a lot of different objectives at the same time, some of which are incompatible with wider Ministry of Education policy goals. For example, one of these key goals is social mixing and inclusivity. And you can see right away that some of the admission criteria might appear to get in the way, as it were, of encouraging greater, say, SES mixing, which the Ministry of Education has publicly acknowledged is an issue that it wants to be dealing with looking ahead. It's not as though there appear to be any foolproof replacement systems right now, because I think each replacement that is proposed comes with its own set of values and its own set of controversies. In other words, not every parent is going to be equally pleased from whatever primary one registration system exists.
Sounds to me like it's a zero-sum game, in a way, right? Can't please everyone.
I think that's the nature of education policy. Because different people are looking for different sorts of things. Different people, too, have different kinds of aspirations for themselves and for their children. And some people might feel, for instance, that it's pretty much up to the individual child to do their best. And let's see what happens. Let's see whether that particular school environment works for you. And I, as a parent, don't want to be overly interventionist. While at the same time, there are parents who might reject that as being rather irresponsible parenting, just preferring to leave things to chance. And this second category of parents might say instead, no, I have to do what it takes to help my child get that extra edge. Because if I don't step up, what's going to happen to my child's education? See, because I'm responsible for what happens.
It's like that regret that you mentioned, right?
That's right.
So if we look at just volunteering, and we've talked about the various issues that the system has, I mean, if we just look at volunteering it specifically, do you think there's a way we can bring the scheme back to its original intention?
If you think about it, how many parents can we realistically expect to be volunteering their services within any particular primary school? We've never really talked about this. What sort of percentage are we thinking about? Obviously, we're not going to have 100% of the parents volunteering their services. And should volunteering be purely altruistic? Should this particular admission phase be completely done away with so as to avoid those sorts of ethical issues that we seem to be discussing right now? I think primary schools would really, like to have parent volunteers to help out with certain sorts of activities. For example, learning journeys. For example, running short courses. For example, helping out, say, with literacy programs. So there's all sorts of ways in which parents can make a difference within schools. You see? So it's how you balance things off so that I guess you don't end up with a rather cold and utilitarian approach where parents volunteer solely for the sake of gaining preferential admission for their own children.
It sounds like that, right, at this point in time.
I don't think any of us has any hard statistics to say one way or the other what's driving individual decisions. So I think it's important for us to not malign parents unfairly. I guess there's probably all sorts of different circumstances out there, some of which we may not be aware of. And that's why I think this sort of diversity complicates the task of policy formulation and implementation. Because very often policy intentions appear noble, but when they are actually rolled out, they may, on occasion, get incorporated into pre-existing attitudes and beliefs about education, about parents' roles. And then they become part of that education arms race instead of serving the original policy intent.
So I guess it sounds to me we could go in two directions for this volunteering thing. So on the one hand, we could maybe double down on it. We could maybe ensure that parents, if they get into the school via the volunteering route, it should be compulsory for them to join the maybe parent support group for a while. So that means that they could contribute long-term and value add more. So that's one way. The second way is to scrap the scheme entirely. What do you think?
Well, I think both of the options that you've presented, both of them have pros and cons. And once again, you'll be upsetting some people no matter which way you go. I think an ideal, which may be difficult to achieve in real life, would be to have parents volunteering their services out of goodwill, out of a genuine desire to help other children besides their own, out of a desire to achieve some of the broader objectives of education. And of course, by volunteering, these parents are also serving as positive role models for the students in terms of such attributes or competencies as responsibility and care.
And they could also kind of be part of their child's journey in school, right? By understanding where they come from, what they're doing in school, and their friends and their teachers as well, right?
That too. Because I think when parents are able to see firsthand what their child is going through in school on a regular basis, there's the potential for them to develop that deeper understanding and appreciation of how complex school life is, of how tough in many ways teachers' work is. And I think another important realization is that schools are social communities. that have to deal with much more than one's individual aspirations or the problems of one's own children. There's a wider school community whose needs need to be taken into consideration as well.
So let's say for option A, the doubling down, we made it compulsory for them to continue because it sounds like the benefit comes from them staying long-term, being part of the PSG. Do you think that would work?
That sounds rather appealing. But as I said, there's that question of flexibility. Because some parents may not be able to continue that sort of commitment into the long term.
So we couldn't bond parents in a way.
Well, I don't think that would be very popular, having these sorts of contracts. Because there's another issue that needs to be taken into consideration, which is that there's also parents who may come on board the volunteering bandwagon later on, after their children have already been admitted. And that's fine too. And they don't get bonded at all. Yes, because the whole idea is it's meant to be something that you do out of your own goodwill and desire to do so. There's always, I guess, all these terms and conditions that people think of, to try and make the registration system more equitable and to reduce that element of what some people say is game playing.
Or gaming the system.
That's right.
I think there's also the capacity issue, right? If we bond parents, could the schools end up having an overflow of parent volunteers some of whom may not even want to be there?
I think that this is an issue that some of our primary schools are currently facing, which is that there are more parents out there who are interested in being parent volunteers than there are opportunities available within each of the primary schools. Because each primary school has that kind of discretion to make these decisions. That's why I think sometimes the schools have to face this decision. How many parent volunteers do we really need? And what sorts of activities can they help out with? Also, I think there's the question of getting parents to understand that being a parent volunteer doesn't necessarily mean that their child will enjoy preferential treatment after they have been admitted to the school. So I think that point needs to come across clearly.
So what if we just dropped the entire scheme of tying it to admissions and just let those who want to volunteer come in at the parent support group level after the kid is admitted into the school? Wouldn't that be better? Sounds like it, right?
Yes, that certainly seems to make quite a bit of sense. But of course, I think there's other aspects of the entire registration system that need to be looked at as well. So I don't think reworking of the volunteering criterion is the only reform that's needed. That I think instead that the entire registration system needs to be seriously looked at to make sure that it's compatible with wider policy goals while at the same time respecting parental choice.
So maybe this could come under a wider revamp of the system, which means it looks like MOE is already kind of looking at that, right?
That's what I believe. Yeah.
And we could maybe see changes to that system, to that volunteering scheme as a whole, right?
I think, once again, it's a lot to do with underlying values. What do we really value and treasure? And how do we rank these values and then translate them in turn into concrete policies?
Okay, so Jason, the government is in the process of reviewing the Primary 1 registration system. And if we look at it as a whole realistically, what do you think is the best move they can make next? Just one small move next to make this process feel less like an arms race?
That's a tough question to answer. I think that what Singapore needs is not just tinkering with various admission criteria within the Primary 1 registration system, but instead, I think, a more foundational reform that really aligns itself very powerfully with broader and wider social policy objectives, such as social equity, such as social mixing. And we see right now that the Primary 1 registration system privileges certain groups of parents over others. And that's really not all that compatible with some of those wider policy goals that I mentioned a few minutes ago. So I would say that instead of tinkering around at the edges, what we need instead is something much more sustained and foundational that gets to the root of many of the issues circling the Primary 1 registration system. At the same time, the registration system doesn't exist in a vacuum. There's also the need, I think, to draw more attention to the ideal every school is a good school, so that there may be less of that anxiety over securing admission to a few of the more popular primary schools. Because as long as we don't address this widespread perception that not every primary school is equally competent and effective at delivering a quality education, then Singapore will continue to struggle, I think, with a lot of these equity issues that are plaguing the current registration system.
Sounds like we're looking at a fundamental reworking of the entire system. MOE has their work cut out for them, in a way.
Oh, most definitely, because I think it's time to get back to fundamental values about which values are the most important and how these values can in turn be translated into concrete policies and be rolled out.
Okay, well, that's a wrap for In Your Opinion. I'm Leanne Chia, and thank you, Jason, for your insights.
Thank you.
So you can email us your thoughts on this issue. Also, if you would like to read ST articles or opinion columns, these links can be found in our podcast show notes. This episode is edited by Hadi Rahim. Thanks for listening.
Send your feedback to podcast@sph.com.sg. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or within our Straits Times app. Thanks for listening.